She was the invisible night nurse who never raised her voice, the woman management tossed out for breaking protocol. But when heavily armed mercenaries locked down Boston Memorial Hospital, the arrogant doctors discovered a terrifying truth. They hadn't dismissed a quiet nurse. They had unleashed a Tier 1 military commander. Margaret Sullivan was a ghost in the fluorescent-lit corridors of Boston Memorial Hospital. At 34, she was the quintessential graveyard shift triage nurse, quiet, unassuming, and completely devoid of the sharp elbows required to climb the hospital's treacherous social ladder. She wore oversized faded blue scrubs that swallowed her athletic frame, her hair perpetually tied back in a messy, practical bun. To the rest of the staff, Maggie was just a reliable set of hands who never complained about taking the worst shifts, never gossiped in the break room, and never questioned the authority of the attending physicians. No one looked closely enough to notice the way she walked, silent heel to toe, a deeply ingrained habit from a past life. No one noticed that her eyes constantly scanned the exits, or that her hands, though gentle when starting, an IV possessed a terrifying, rock-steady stillness. The undisputed king of the night shift was Dr. Gregory Harrison, the chief of surgery's nephew. Gregory was a man whose ambition vastly outpaced his clinical skill. He wore custom-tailored scrubs, spent half his shift flirting with the interns, and treated the nursing staff like indentured servants. It was 2:14 a.m. on a relentless Tuesday when the trauma bay doors blew open. Paramedics rushed in, wheeling a gurney slick with crimson. "John Doe, mid-40s, the lead paramedic shouted over the chaos. "Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest and abdomen. Blood pressure is dropping fast, currently 70/40. He's tachycardic. We lost his pulse twice in the rig." Dr. Harrison jogged into the trauma bay, coffee still in hand. He took one look at the catastrophic bleeding and froze. The confident swagger drained from his posture. "Get him on the monitors. Push 2 units of O-negative. "Where is the on-call trauma surgeon?" 10 minutes out, Dr. A resident replied, her voice trembling. The patient's heart monitor emitted a sharp, continuous shrill. He was crashing. The gunshot wound to the abdomen had severed something major, likely the descending aorta. Blood was pooling in his abdominal cavity, faster than they could pump it into his veins. "He's going into hypovolemic shock," Maggie stated, her voice unnervingly calm, cutting through the rising panic in the room. She was already at the head of the bed, securing the airway. "Doctor, we need to place a reboa catheter immediately to stop the internal bleeding, or he'll be dead in 60 seconds. Gregory snapped out of his stupor, his ego flaring to mask his incompetence. "A reboa? Without the attending, absolutely not. That's a highly invasive endovascular procedure. We follow protocol here, Nurse Sullivan. Push more EP and keep doing chest compressions." "Chest compressions will only pump the remaining blood out of his bullet wounds," Maggie replied. She stepped away from the airway and moved to the patient's femoral artery. "He is bleeding out. Protocol will kill him. Step away from the patient, Margaret," Gregory yelled, his face flushing red. "That is a direct order." Maggie didn't look at him. She looked at the dying man on the table. In her mind, the pristine white walls of Boston Memorial faded, replaced by the suffocating dust of a black site surgical tent in Kandahar. She had performed this exact procedure under heavy mortar fire with a flashlight held between her teeth. "I'm sorry, doctor," Maggie said softly. "I cannot comply." Before Gregory could physically intervene, Maggie moved with blinding speed. She grabbed a scalpel, made a precise incision at the femoral artery, and inserted the introducer sheath. Her hands were a blur of calculated lethal efficiency. She threaded the resuscitative endovascular balloon occlusion of the aorta reboa catheter up into the patient's descending aorta and inflated the balloon, clamping off the blood supply to the ruptured vessels below. The monitor's frantic beeping began to stabilize. The patient's blood pressure slowly crept upward. The room fell dead silent. The intern stared in absolute shock. A quiet triage nurse had just performed a highly advanced surgical intervention, flawlessly bypassing the chief resident and saving the patient's life. Gregory's face twisted in humiliated rage. "You are done, Sullivan," he spat, pointing a shaking finger at her. "You are finished in this hospital." By 8 a.m., Maggie found herself sitting in the plush mahogany-paneled office of Pamela Jenkins, the chief hospital administrator. Pamela was a woman who viewed medicine purely through the lens of liability insurance and corporate optics. Beside her stood a smug Dr. Harrison, practicing medicine without a license, insubordination, reckless endangerment. Pamela read from a freshly printed document, her tone dripping with bureaucratic disdain. "Nurse Sullivan, you bypassed a senior physician to perform an unauthorized surgical procedure. Do you have any idea the legal jeopardy you've put Boston Memorial in?" "The patient is alive," Maggie said evenly. She sat perfectly straight in her chair, her expression unreadable. If I had waited for Dr. Harrison to remember his medical school training, the patient would be in the morgue. Gregory scoffed. "She's delusional, Pamela. She got lucky. It was a reckless cowboy move." Pamela slammed the folder shut. "We have zero tolerance for mavericks, Ms. Sullivan. You are a nurse. Your job is to follow orders, not to play God. You are terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you to your locker. You have 15 minutes to vacate the premises, and frankly, you should be grateful we aren't pursuing criminal charges." Maggie didn't argue. She didn't cry. She simply stood up, her face a mask of utter indifference. "Understood." She turned and walked out of the office, leaving Pamela and Gregory exchanging satisfied, triumphant looks. They had no idea they had just fired Lieutenant Commander Margaret Sullivan, the former commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Development Group's elite covert medical triage unit, a woman who had spent a decade operating on JSOC operators behind enemy lines. And they had no idea that the man Maggie had just saved wasn't a random civilian, but a high-value federal asset. The basement locker room of Boston Memorial was damp and smelled faintly of bleach. Maggie opened locker 42, quietly folding her extra scrubs and placing them into her duffel bag. From the top shelf, she pulled down a small, heavy wooden box. Inside rested her old tarnished dog tags and a folded photograph of a heavily armed SEAL team standing in front of a Black Hawk helicopter. Maggie was in the center, wearing a plate carrier, a customized Sig Sauer sidearm strapped to her thigh, and a weary smile. She ran her thumb over the metal tags. She had left that life behind 3 years ago after a mission in Syria went catastrophically wrong, opting for the quiet anonymity of civilian nursing to quiet the ghosts in her head. Clack. The fluorescent lights overhead instantly died. The locker room was plunged into pitch darkness. A second later, the dull, rhythmic hum of the hospital's HVAC system ground to a halt. Maggie paused. The emergency backup generators were supposed to kick in within 4 seconds of a grid failure. 5 seconds passed. 10 seconds. Nothing. Her heart rate normally resting at a cool 50 beats per minute didn't spike, but her senses heightened. This wasn't a blown transformer. Someone had manually severed the main power lines and disabled the backup generators. Through the thick concrete ceiling of the basement, a sound echoed down from the floors above. It was muffled, but Maggie's ears were trained to recognize it instantly. Pop, pop, suppressed gunfire. Maggie zipped her duffel bag shut. The quiet nurse vanished in the darkness. The lieutenant commander took over. 4 floors up, the intensive care unit had descended into a nightmare. 6 men clad in sterile black tactical gear and Kevlar vests had breached the emergency stairwells. They moved in perfect synchronized violence, securing the perimeter of the ICU. They wore no insignias, and their faces were covered by black balaclavas. Dr. Gregory Harrison, who had been completing his morning rounds, was thrown forcefully against the nurse's station by a massive mercenary. Pamela Jenkins, who had come down to the ICU to personally review the John Doe's charts, screamed as an assault rifle was pointed directly at her chest. "Nobody moves, nobody speaks," the lead mercenary barked. He grabbed a terrified intern by the hair, throwing him to the floor. "Where is the gunshot victim brought in last night? Room 412. Where is it?" Gregory, trembling so violently he could barely stand, pointed a shaking finger down the hall. "To there at the end of the hall. Please take him. Just don't hurt us." The leader motioned to 2 of his men. "Secure the target. If he's connected to machines, unhook him. We extract in 6 minutes. Execute anyone who reaches for a phone." Down in the basement, Maggie slipped out of the locker room and moved down the maintenance corridor. She needed weapons communications and intel. She bypassed the security desk, finding the guard unconscious and zip-tied, and slipped into the hospital's subterranean pharmacy and surgical supply cache. She moved quickly in the dark, her memory guiding her through the aisles. She grabbed a pair of heavy surgical trauma shears, several glass ampules of a highly volatile chemical solvent, and a handful of disposable scalpels. It wasn't a standard JSOC loadout, but Maggie had killed men with far less. She reached the basement stairwell just as the door cracked open. A single mercenary slipped inside his assault rifle, raised, scanning the shadows with a weapon-mounted flashlight. He was a perimeter guard sent to ensure no staff members escaped through the subterranean loading docks. Maggie pressed herself against the cold concrete wall, melting into the blind spot behind the heavy steel door. She held her breath, regulating her adrenaline. The mercenary stepped fully into the stairwell, sweeping his light, left, then right. He was a professional, but his muzzle discipline was slightly lazy. He let the barrel dip for a fraction of a second as he turned. That was all Maggie needed. She lunged from the shadows like a coiled spring. Her left hand shot out, grabbing the searing hot barrel of the rifle and violently wrenching it upward away from her center mass. Simultaneously, she drove her right hand forward, burying the heavy steel trauma shears deep into the soft, unarmored gap between the mercenary's Kevlar collar and his helmet. The man let out a wet, gargled gasp. Before he could pull the trigger or reach for his radio, Maggie swept his legs out from under him, riding him to the floor to silence the impact of his body. She held him down, her hand clamped securely over his mouth, watching his eyes widen in shock as his life rapidly faded away on the cold concrete. Within 30 seconds, the man was dead. Maggie stripped his tactical vest, checking the radio clipped to his shoulder. It was encrypted, operating on a rolling UHF frequency. She pulled the earpiece from the dead man's ear and slotted it into her own. "Viper 2 perimeter is secure. Target is acquired, but unstable. Prepping for immediate extraction via the roof." A harsh, static-laced voice commanded through the earpiece. Maggie unclipped the man's Sig Sauer MCX rifle, checking the chamber and dropping the magazine to inspect the ammunition. Armor-piercing rounds. She also took his sidearm, a combat knife, and 3 spare magazines. She tapped the mic on the stolen radio, clicking it twice a standard military signal for acknowledgement, before turning it off to avoid broadcasting her breathing. Dr. Harrison and Pamela Jenkins had fired her for trying to save a life. Now the hospital was compromised by highly trained killers, and the local police wouldn't stand a chance against an organized extraction team of this caliber. Maggie racked the charging handle of the MCX, the metallic clack echoing sharply in the silent stairwell. She wasn't just a nurse anymore. She was the only thing standing between Boston Memorial Hospital and a total massacre. She pushed the stairwell door open and began the long, silent climb up to the 4th floor. The 4th floor stairwell door felt icy against Maggie's palm. She paused, closing her eyes and visualizing the intensive care unit's layout. The ICU was a horseshoe-shaped ward with the nurses' station at the dead center and patient rooms lining the outer perimeter. Room 412, where the high-value target was hooked up to the monitors, was positioned at the far end of the right corridor. The mercenary leader had dispatched 2 men to secure the patient, leaving at least 3 in the central hub holding the medical staff hostage. Maggie took a slow, calculated breath. She cracked the heavy fire door open just enough to see the reflection of the hallway in the polished metallic surface of a nearby crash cart. 2 heavily armed men in black tactical gear were pacing near the central desk, their assault rifles held at the low ready. Dr. Gregory Harrison was kneeling on the linoleum floor, his hands clamped over his head, weeping openly. Pamela Jenkins was huddled beside him, her immaculate designer suit ruined by the spilled coffee and sheer terror of the situation. "Move faster with the target, Wyatt." The lead mercenary, a towering man with a scarred jawline, barked into his shoulder radio. "The local police will have units circling the block in less than 4 minutes. I want him unplugged and on the roof now. If he bleeds out during transport, that is not our problem. Our contract just says we deliver him." Maggie analyzed her limited arsenal. She had the stolen Sig Sauer MCX, a combat knife, the heavy surgical shears, and the glass ampules of chemical solvent she had procured from the pharmacy. A direct firefight in an oxygen-rich environment like the ICU was tactical suicide. A stray bullet hitting a pressurized oxygen line would trigger a catastrophic explosion that would kill everyone, including the hostages. She had to neutralize them with surgical precision. She retrieved a spare oxygen canister from a gurney abandoned in the stairwell. Taking an ampule of the volatile chemical solvent, she wrapped it tightly in medical gauze and taped it to the canister's pressure valve. She then pulled the pin on a flashbang grenade she had stripped from the dead guard downstairs, wedging the spoon under the canister so it would act as a delayed fuse once she rolled it. "Hey, I need someone down in the basement. Viper 2 isn't responding," the leader yelled, his voice echoing down the sterile hallway. One of the pacing guards nodded, turning toward the stairwell. Maggie kicked the door open violently. She rolled the rigged oxygen canister down the hallway, the heavy metal cylinder clattering loudly against the polished floor. "Grenade!" the approaching mercenary screamed, diving behind the reinforced nurse's station. The flashbang detonated, shattering the ampule of solvent. The resulting chemical reaction didn't cause a fiery explosion, but rather a concussive shockwave, followed immediately by a massive blinding cloud of dense white acidic smoke that instantly flooded the central hub. The lights overhead flickered wildly as the smoke triggered the ward's fire suppression alarms. The deafening blare of the sirens completely masked the sound of Maggie's approach. She moved into the smoke like a phantom, relying entirely on her muscle memory and the tactical layout mapped in her mind. The first mercenary was coughing violently, his vision entirely obscured by the dense chemical fog. Maggie didn't shoot. She closed the distance in 3 silent strides, grabbed his tactical harness, and drove her combat knife upward through the vulnerable gap beneath his armpit, severing the brachial artery and puncturing his lung. He dropped without a sound. The leader, realizing his men were blind and under attack, began firing blindly into the smoke. The supersonic rounds shattered the glass walls of the empty patient rooms, raining jagged shrapnel everywhere. Maggie dropped to the floor, sliding beneath the trajectory of the wild gunfire. She crawled past the weeping Gregory and the paralyzed Pamela, her focus locked on the muzzle flashes illuminating the dense fog. She raised the stolen MCX rifle, bracing the stock tightly against her shoulder. She breathed out, letting her heart rate drop into the familiar freezing calm of combat. Bang, bang. 2 suppressed shots echoed through the chaos. Both rounds found their mark with mathematical precision, striking the leader's weapon and completely destroying the firing mechanism before ricocheting into his shoulder armor. He roared in pain, dropping the ruined assault rifle and drawing his sidearm. By the time the smoke began to clear, drawn out by the emergency ventilation systems kicking in the chaotic scene, finally revealed itself to the terrified hostages. Dr. Gregory Harrison slowly opened his eyes, expecting to see heavily armed SWAT officers. Instead, his jaw dropped in absolute shock. Standing in the center of the devastated ICU, wearing faded blue scrubs, now stained with blood and soot, was Margaret Sullivan. The quiet, invisible night nurse held an assault rifle with the practiced lethal confidence of a seasoned combat veteran. She stood over the downed mercenary, the barrel of her weapon aimed directly at the gap in his body armor. Nurse Sullivan, Pamela Jenkins, whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. What are you doing? How did you—" Maggie didn't look at her former bosses. Her eyes were locked down the hallway toward room 412. "Stay on the floor, Pamela. Keep your hands visible. The police are useless right now. These men jammed the local cellular towers before they breached the hospital. You killed him," Gregory stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the lifeless mercenary bleeding out near the nurse's station. The arrogant surgeon was entirely shattered by the brutal reality unfolding in front of him. "You're just a triage nurse. I am Lieutenant Commander Margaret Sullivan, United States Navy, Naval Special Warfare Development Group," Maggie stated coldly, never taking her eyes off the hallway. "And right now, I am the only reason you are still breathing, Doctor. Do exactly as I say, or you will die in this hallway." Before Gregory could process the massive revelation, heavy footsteps echoed from the right corridor. The 2 remaining mercenaries, having heard the commotion, were dragging the high-value target out of room 412. The patient, heavily sedated and hooked to a portable vitals monitor, was slung over the shoulder of a massive mercenary named Wyatt. "Contact front," Maggie shouted, raising her rifle. Wyatt and his partner immediately opened fire, peppering the nurse's station with armor-piercing rounds. Maggie dove behind a reinforced structural pillar, returning fire in controlled, calculated bursts. She couldn't shoot to kill, not while Wyatt was using the helpless patient as a human shield. She needed to force them into a bottleneck. "Move to the emergency stairwell," the mercenary carrying the patient yelled to his partner. "The roof extraction is blown. We take them to the secondary rally point. Grab the hostages." The uninjured mercenary sprinted forward under the covering fire, grabbing Dr. Harrison by the collar of his custom scrubs and hauling him violently to his feet. "Get up, Doc. You're coming with us." "No, please let me go," Gregory screamed, thrashing wildly. His expensive tailored scrubs ripped as the mercenary dragged him backward toward the emergency exit doors leading to the roof access stairs. Maggie realized their tactical shift immediately. They were abandoning the stealth extraction and transitioning to a hostage scenario to guarantee their escape. She checked her magazine. She had 8 rounds left. The situation was rapidly deteriorating, and the clock was ticking down to 0. The quiet nurse vanished entirely, leaving only the Tier 1 operator to finish the mission she hadn't asked for. The heavy steel door leading to the roof slammed shut, the metallic echo vibrating through the concrete stairwell. Maggie pursued them relentlessly, taking the stairs 3 at a time. The air grew noticeably colder as she ascended the sterile hospital smell, replaced by the sharp ozone-heavy scent of an approaching summer thunderstorm. Rain was already beginning to lash against the narrow, frosted windows of the stairwell. She reached the final landing just as the mercenaries breached the roof. The storm was brutal. Sheets of freezing rain swept across the flat tar paper expanse of Boston Memorial's rooftop. In the distance, the rhythmic, heavy thumping of a private unmarked helicopter's rotor blades cut through the howling wind. The extraction bird was coming in hot, flying dangerously low to avoid local aviation radar. Maggie kicked the roof access door open, keeping her profile low. The scene on the roof was chaotic. Wyatt had dropped the sedated patient onto the wet tar, frantically waving a red chemical light to signal the approaching helicopter. The second mercenary had Dr. Gregory Harrison pinned against the concrete ledge of the roof, a heavy black pistol pressed firmly against the surgeon's temple. Pamela Jenkins, who had been dragged up as well, was sobbing hysterically on the ground nearby. "Drop the weapon." "Sullivan, the mercenary holding." Gregory screamed over the roaring wind and the thumping rotors. "Drop the damn rifle or I blow his brains all over the street. Do it now." Maggie stepped fully onto the roof, the freezing rain instantly soaking her scrubs. She didn't lower her weapon. She kept the holographic sight perfectly aligned with the mercenary's face. Gregory was sobbing uncontrollably. "Please, Margaret, please do what he says. I'm sorry for firing you. I'm sorry. Just please don't let him kill me." "Shut up, Gregory," Maggie said, her voice surprisingly calm, carrying effortlessly over the storm. She stared dead into the mercenary's eyes. "You don't want to do this. You shoot him, you lose your leverage. You shoot him, and I will put a 5.56 round through your left eye before his body even hits the ground." The mercenary hesitated, his finger trembling on the trigger. He was highly trained, but he was accustomed to fighting civilians and local law enforcement, not a seasoned JSOC commander who refused to play by standard hostage negotiation protocols. The unmarked helicopter hovered 30 feet above the landing pad, a heavy side door sliding open to reveal a mounted machine gunner preparing to lay down suppressing fire. Maggie had less than 5 seconds before the heavy gunner turned the roof into a slaughterhouse. She needed a distraction. She glanced quickly at the medical equipment the mercenaries had dragged up with the patient. The portable defibrillator lay on the wet tar, its heavily insulated paddles exposed to the pouring rain. "I said drop it," the mercenary roared, pressing the barrel harder into Gregory's head. "Okay," Maggie yelled back. "You win." She slowly lowered the assault rifle, bending her knees as if to place it on the ground. As she crouched, Her free hand violently snatched one of the heavy defibrillator paddles. She slammed her thumb onto the maximum charge button. The machine whined sharply, charging to 360 joules in a fraction of a second. Instead of dropping the rifle, Maggie spun with terrifying speed and hurled the charged heavy plastic paddle directly at the mercenary's face. It wasn't a lethal projectile, but the heavy, unaerodynamic object flying through the rain triggered the mercenary's flinch reflex. He ducked, pulling his weapon away from Gregory's head for exactly 1 second. It was the only second Maggie needed. She brought the rifle up in a fluid, practiced motion. Bang! The single round struck the mercenary squarely in the chest plate. While the body armor stopped the bullet from penetrating, the massive kinetic energy of the armor-piercing round shattered his ribs, throwing him backward against the concrete parapet. He collapsed, gasping for air, dropping his pistol over the ledge. Wyatt, seeing his partner fall, abandoned the patient and raised his weapon toward Maggie. But before he could fire, the deafening sound of police sirens finally pierced the storm. Dozens of flashing red and blue lights illuminated the streets below. 4 heavily armed FBI tactical helicopters suddenly broke through the cloud cover surrounding the unmarked mercenary bird. Federal Bureau of Investigation power, down your engines and prepare to be boarded. A booming voice echoed from the FBI chopper's loudspeaker. The mercenary pilot, realizing the contract was thoroughly blown, immediately banked hard to the left, abandoning Wyatt on the roof and vanishing into the stormy night sky. Wyatt looked at the fleeing helicopter, then at the heavily armed federal choppers hovering above, and finally at Maggie, who had her rifle aimed directly at his chest. Slowly, defeatedly, he lowered his weapon and raised his hands into the freezing rain. 10 minutes later, the roof was swarming with FBI tactical agents and local SWAT teams. The storm had passed, leaving behind a cold, wet morning. Dr. Gregory Harrison and Pamela Jenkins sat on the edge of a specialized medical gurney wrapped in thick thermal blankets. They were both entirely speechless, staring in shell-shocked silence as a senior FBI agent wearing a windbreaker approached Margaret Sullivan. Maggie had handed her stolen weapons to the SWAT team and was currently kneeling beside the high-value patient, calmly checking the Reboa catheter she had inserted hours earlier. The patient's vitals were strong. Commander Sullivan, the senior FBI agent, said, extending his hand with deep respect. "Agent Reynolds, we've been tracking this Aegis Vanguard hit squad for months. We had no idea they tracked the witness to this hospital. Your file said you retired from active duty 3 years ago." "I did," Maggie replied, shaking his hand firmly. "I'm just a nurse now." Pamela Jenkins, shivering beneath her blanket, finally found her voice. "A nurse? You are a military commander. Why didn't you tell us? Why did you let us treat you like you were nobody?" Maggie stood up, wiping the rain and soot from her face. She looked at Pamela and then at the humiliated, thoroughly broken Dr. Harrison. "Because I didn't come here to wear my medals, Pamela. I came here to save lives," Maggie said softly, the quiet nurse returning to her voice. "A hospital isn't a battlefield. It's a sanctuary. You two forgot that. You let your egos dictate patient care." We can give you your job back," Gregory stammered, his arrogance completely evaporated, replaced by genuine awe and terror. "Chief of Nursing. Anything you want, Margaret." Maggie slung her duffel bag over her shoulder. She looked around the rooftop at the flashing lights, the arrested mercenaries, and the federal agents securing the area. She had missed the quiet anonymity, but she knew her cover was permanently blown. "Keep the job, Doctor," Maggie said, turning toward the stairwell. "I think it's time I found a new hospital. Try not to fire the next nurse who saves your patient." As she walked away, descending back into the sterile hallways she had just fought to protect the FBI agents, parted respectfully to let her pass. The invisible night nurse was gone, leaving behind a legacy that Boston Memorial Hospital would whisper about for decades to come. If you were captivated by this intense story of hidden heroism and medical drama, please hit that like button and share it with your friends. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired stories where ordinary people reveal their extraordinary hidden pasts. Leave a comment below letting us know your favorite plot twist and ring the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us bring more heart-pounding narratives directly to your awesome screen.